Caesar's ambitious conquest of Gaul, the making of a legend. The Romans of the 1st century BC were a people defined by ambition and conquest, yet they were also haunted by ancient memories of humiliation. In their collective memory lay a sharp and bitter scar. The terrible day in 390 BC when Gallic warriors sacked Rome itself. Though centuries had passed, the trauma remained, shaping Rome's policies and stoking a deep, almost primal fear of the Gauls. But now, as the Republic neared its end, Rome was again poised to confront its ancient enemy, not from necessity, but as a means for one man to rise above all others. Julius Caesar, the name that would echo through history, was not yet the conqueror or dictator that we remember. In his early career, he was a man with towering debts, a reputation for ruthlessness, and, above all, an insatiable ambition. To understand how he came to conquer Gaul, we must first understand why he needed to. Rome, though rich and powerful, was a brutal political arena. Caesar's political campaigns and personal debts weighed heavily on him, and for him, Gaul was more than a battlefield. It was a means to secure wealth, power, and lasting fame. Rome and Gaul, a legacy of fear and rivalry. At the heart of Caesar's motivation lay the history of Rome's dealings with the Gauls. By Caesar's time, Rome had expanded its control into southern Gaul, establishing the province of Transalpine Gaul as a buffer between Rome and the untamed northern tribes. To the Romans, these tribes represented everything foreign and frightening. Their independence, warrior culture, and frequent infighting were seen as primitive, even savage, but they were also admired for their bravery and resilience. Gallic society was complex and deeply rooted in tribal loyalty. Unlike Rome, Gaul had no central authority or unified identity. Instead, it was a tapestry of tribes, each with its own leaders, customs, and feuds. The lack of unity made the Gallic tribes vulnerable to both internal conflicts and external threats. For the Romans, this division was an opportunity, one Caesar would exploit to devastating effect. But before he could embark on his campaign, an event occurred that provided him with the perfect justification for intervention: the migration of the Helvetii. The Helvetii migration, Caesar's justification for war. The Helvetii, a Gallic tribe settled in what is now Switzerland, found themselves under pressure from both internal issues and Germanic tribes threatening from the east. Under the guidance of a bold leader named Orgetorix, the Helvetii decided on a radical solution. They would leave their homeland behind and migrate en masse to western Gaul, where they hoped to find new land and greater security. Orgetorix's plan was ambitious. The Helvetii burned their villages, leaving behind all that was familiar to embrace the unknown. A bold move that spoke to their desperation and determination. However, this migration meant they would pass directly through territories under Roman control, an act that Caesar would not ignore. To him, the Helvetii migration was a gift, a legitimate reason to intervene in Gaul and, more importantly, a chance to prove himself as a protector of Rome. The Battle of Bibracte, Caesar's first major victory. When the Helvetii's migration began, Caesar moved quickly. He called upon his legions stationed in Cisalpine Gaul, deploying them to intercept the Helvetii before they could reach their destination. The resulting battle, known as the Battle of Bibracte, was a fierce confrontation that showcased Caesar's military acumen and the discipline of his troops. Caesar's forces engaged the Helvetii with precision and ferocity, driving them back and securing a resounding victory. At Bibracte, Caesar demonstrated not only his tactical skill but also his understanding of psychological warfare. By decisively defeating the Helvetii, he sent a message to all of Gaul. Rome was not only powerful but also unyielding. This victory was more than a battle. It was a statement. The Gauls, watching from afar, took note. A threat from the east, the Germanic king Ariovistus. With the Helvetii defeated, Caesar's attention turned to a new threat, the Germanic king Ariovistus, who had established a stronghold in Gaul at the invitation of the Gallic Sequani tribe. Ariovistus's growing influence worried many Gallic leaders, who saw him as an outsider and a conqueror. Sensing an opportunity to position himself as a protector of the Gauls, Caesar offered his support to the tribes seeking to expel Ariovistus. Caesar's engagement with Ariovistus began with tense negotiations. In a dramatic meeting, the two leaders confronted each other, with Caesar demanding that Ariovistus withdraw from Gaul. Ariovistus, confident in his strength, refused, claiming that Rome had no right to interfere in Gallic affairs. Their exchange was a clash not only of leaders but of worldviews. To Ariovistus, power was a matter of might. To Caesar, it was a matter of destiny. When diplomacy failed, Caesar took to the battlefield once more. The resulting confrontation was brutal, with Roman discipline clashing against Germanic ferocity. Caesar's victory over Ariovistus was a turning point. It secured Rome's influence in Gaul and further elevated Caesar's reputation, both in Rome and among the Gauls who now saw him as a force to be reckoned with. The strategy of divide and conquer. With Ariovistus defeated, Caesar now turned his attention to consolidating Rome's power in Gaul. His strategy was as brilliant as it was ruthless. He would divide the Gallic tribes, pitting them against one another to weaken any unified resistance. Caesar's diplomatic maneuvering was masterful. He formed alliances with certain tribes, offering protection and support, while isolating others that he deemed a threat. In doing so, Caesar leveraged the internal divisions of Gallic society. The tribal leaders, often rivals themselves, were wary of each other and more willing to seek Roman support than to unite against him. Caesar played on these fears, presenting himself as both a protector and an arbiter, while quietly expanding his control. Through a combination of military might and political cunning, he began to reshape the political landscape of Gaul in Rome's favor. Caesar's rising influence in Rome. As word of Caesar's victories spread, his influence in Rome grew. His successes in Gaul not only enriched him but also bolstered his political standing, allowing him to repay his debts and secure loyalty among his soldiers. However, his rising power also stirred resentment among the Roman elite. Many senators saw Caesar's conquests as a threat to the Republic, fearing that his growing popularity and military strength could lead to a concentration of power unprecedented in Roman history. Back in Rome, the Senate watched with a mixture of admiration and anxiety. Caesar's actions were bold, even audacious, and his disregard for tradition was both inspiring and alarming. The seeds of conflict between Caesar and the Senate were already being sown, and Gaul was the proving ground upon which Caesar would build his path to absolute power. The unfolding drama, the future of Gaul. Caesar's campaign in Gaul was far from over. The battles against the Helvetii and Ariovistus were only the beginning, a prelude to the larger conflicts that would define his conquest. Ahead lay new challenges, including rebellions, shifting alliances, and fierce resistance from Gallic leaders who were determined to defend their homeland. In time, Caesar would come to face one of his greatest rivals in Gaul, Vercingetorix, a young and charismatic leader who would unite the tribes in a final, desperate struggle against Roman domination. But that is a story for another time. For now, Caesar stands victorious, his name whispered across Gaul as both a hero and a conqueror. The path he has chosen is one of ambition and audacity, and though he has yet to realize it, his conquest of Gaul will not only change the fate of the Gallic tribes, but also reshape the destiny of Rome itself. Caesar's Gaul campaign, from conqueror to the edge of revolt. As the campaign wore on, the battlefields of Gaul bore witness to an unfolding drama of resistance, betrayal, and Caesar's relentless ambition. For Caesar, each victory was not merely a conquest. It was a stepping stone in his unrelenting pursuit of glory, a test of his ability to reshape the world according to his will. But the Gauls were not yet defeated. Beneath the uneasy submission lay simmering resentment, and in the distance, a leader was emerging who would challenge Caesar in ways he had not yet faced. The story of Caesar's conquest of Gaul moves now to a critical chapter, one where the conquered would rise and the conqueror would be forced to confront both the limits of his power and the resilience of the people he sought to dominate. Enter Vercingetorix, the spark of rebellion. Among the Gauls, word of Caesar's victories spread like wildfire. For some, the Roman general was a god of war. For others, he was a threat to everything they held dear. In the shadow of these mixed sentiments, a figure began to emerge, Vercingetorix, a young chieftain from the Arverni tribe. Vercingetorix was no ordinary leader. He understood that the strength of Rome lay not only in its military prowess but in its capacity to divide and conquer. To stand a chance, the Gauls would have to unite as never before. Vercingetorix's call for unity was both a bold and desperate strategy. The Gauls, fiercely independent by nature, had never before joined as one against an external force. Yet Vercingetorix, charismatic and visionary, managed to bring them together, urging them to embrace a scorched earth policy that would deprive the Romans of resources. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and livestock slaughtered to prevent Caesar's legions from sustaining themselves off the land. This was a sacrifice that required a level of loyalty and resolve previously unseen among the Gauls, a testament to Vercingetorix's leadership. In Rome, Caesar's enemies in the Senate watched these developments with interest. Many hoped for Caesar's defeat, knowing that any setback in Gaul would weaken his political influence at home. Caesar, however, was undeterred. For him, Vercingetorix was not merely an obstacle. He was an opportunity to further prove his invincibility. But the challenges he now faced were unlike any he had encountered before. The Siege of Avaricum, a battle of wills. The first major confrontation between Caesar and Vercingetorix took place at Avaricum, a fortified town that Vercingetorix considered essential to his strategy. The Siege of Avaricum was brutal and costly, with Caesar's forces pushing through relentless rain and muddy terrain to establish their siege works. Vercingetorix, well aware of the importance of the town, mobilized his forces to break the siege. Yet, Caesar's resolve and the discipline of his legions held firm. Avaricum's fall was a devastating blow to the Gauls. Caesar ordered no mercy. His troops sacked the town, killing nearly all its inhabitants. This massacre was a chilling demonstration of Roman power, a psychological maneuver meant to strike fear into the hearts of any who might resist. For the Gauls, however, Avaricum became a rallying cry, a symbol of Roman cruelty and the price of submission. And for Vercingetorix, it was a stark reminder of the high stakes in his war against Rome. Turning points: the brutal winter and the Battle of Gergovia. Following the fall of Avaricum, Caesar's forces pressed on, moving toward Gergovia, the capital of Vercingetorix's Arverni tribe. Gergovia was a fortress perched atop a steep hill, a location that gave the defenders a significant advantage. For Caesar, capturing Gergovia was essential to his plan to demoralize and fragment the Gauls. However, this time he underestimated the resolve of his enemies. The battle for Gergovia would prove to be a rare defeat for Caesar. His attempts to assault the hilltop stronghold were met with fierce resistance, and the Roman legions suffered heavy casualties. Caesar, uncharacteristically forced to retreat, found his campaign shaken. The Gauls, encouraged by this victory, began to believe that perhaps the Romans were not invincible after all. Gergovia was more than just a battle. It was a turning point that reinvigorated the Gauls' will to resist. Caesar, however, was not one to dwell on defeat. Rather than sulk or second-guess his tactics, he recalibrated his strategy. This loss, though painful, provided valuable lessons in adapting his approach to the terrain and to the increasingly resourceful tactics of the Gauls under Vercingetorix. The final stand, the Siege of Alesia. The tension between Caesar and Vercingetorix would reach its climax at the fortress of Alesia. Located on a hill and surrounded by rivers, Alesia was a nearly impregnable position, a fitting site for what would become the final, decisive showdown. Caesar, determined to end the war and secure his legacy, laid siege to the fortress, encircling it with an astonishing double line of fortifications to prevent any escape or reinforcements. The Siege of Alesia was a testament to Caesar's military genius and his understanding of psychological warfare. Trapped within the fortress, Vercingetorix and his men faced starvation as their supplies dwindled. Outside, a massive Gallic relief force attempted to break through Caesar's lines, but each attempt was met with fierce resistance. The Romans fought with a desperation that reflected not only their loyalty to Caesar, but their own understanding of what was at stake. They knew that a defeat here would likely mean the end of Caesar's campaign and a collapse of Roman power in Gaul. In the final, desperate moments, Vercingetorix made a bold attempt to break out, leading a charge against the Roman fortifications. But Caesar's defenses held, and the Gallic forces were repelled. With no hope of escape or reinforcement, Vercingetorix realized that the only path left was surrender. His final act, emerging from the fortress and laying down his arms at Caesar's feet, symbolized not just the defeat of a man, but the end of an era for Gaul. Aftermath: Caesar's triumph and the cost of conquest. With the fall of Alesia, Caesar had achieved what no Roman before him had done: the complete and total conquest of Gaul. His campaign brought Rome immense wealth, land, and resources, but the cost of conquest had been steep. Gaul was devastated, its villages razed, its people either killed or subjugated. Caesar's victory secured his reputation and bolstered his political power, but it also deepened the divide between him and the Senate. Back in Rome, Caesar's triumph was celebrated, but it was also viewed with suspicion. His unmatched popularity, wealth, and military loyalty made him a dangerous figure in the eyes of the Senate. They feared his ambition, sensing that his conquests were not merely for the glory of Rome but for his own ascent to power. The campaign in Gaul had given him the means to challenge the established order, setting him on a collision course with the Roman Republic itself. Legacy and reflection: the making of Caesar the dictator. In the years following his conquest, Caesar's actions in Gaul would echo throughout the ages. His success reshaped not only the map of Europe but also the very nature of Roman politics. His crossing of the Rubicon, a phrase now synonymous with passing a point of no return, marked the beginning of the end for the Roman Republic. His conquest of Gaul was not merely a military campaign. It was a pivot point in history, one that would lead to the rise of the Roman Empire. Looking back, one can see that Caesar's legacy in Gaul was as complex as the man himself. He was a brilliant strategist and a relentless conqueror, but he was also a man of ambition whose actions brought untold suffering to the people of Gaul. For the Gauls, Caesar's legacy was one of tragedy and loss, a story of resistance and defiance in the face of overwhelming power. For Rome, he became a legend, a figure whose very name would define the concept of power for centuries to come. In the end, Caesar's campaign in Gaul was a story of ambition, conquest, and the high price of glory, a story that reminds us of the power of human will and the cost of unchecked ambition. The Gauls, under Vercingetorix, fought bravely to defend their land and their way of life, leaving a legacy of resilience and defiance. But Caesar's ambition was unstoppable, a force that would reshape the ancient world and reverberate through history, leaving a legacy that would be both celebrated and feared. Caesar's return to Rome, the path to civil war and the fall of the Republic. In the immediate aftermath of Caesar's triumph in Gaul, the seasoned general knew that his journey was far from over. With the provinces subdued and the vast wealth of Gaul now filling the coffers of Rome, Caesar found himself at a crucial juncture. His victories had elevated his status to that of a living legend, but his political opponents back in Rome were growing ever more anxious. For them, Caesar was no longer just a war hero. He had become a threat to the Republic's very foundation. As we delve into this final part of Caesar's story, we follow him on his return to Rome, a journey that would prove as perilous as his campaigns. Caesar would have to navigate political intrigue, personal betrayal, and a system bent on his destruction. His eventual crossing of the Rubicon would not only mark a historical watershed, but would also signal the beginning of a civil war that would change the face of Rome forever. The politics of power: Caesar versus the Senate. Caesar's military accomplishments had earned him immense popularity among the Roman people. His distribution of wealth, as well as his strategic use of public celebrations and gladiatorial games, won the hearts of the citizens and the loyalty of his soldiers. This popular support, however, set him on a collision course with the Senate. The Senate was alarmed by Caesar's unprecedented influence, which they saw as a direct challenge to their authority. In Rome, the ruling elite feared that Caesar's ambitions might extend beyond Gaul and into the seat of Roman government itself. Prominent senators, including his once ally and mentor Pompey, were wary of Caesar's growing power. Pompey, who had himself been a celebrated general and once held similar ambitions, saw in Caesar a mirror of his younger self, and he knew the risks that such unchecked power could bring to the Republic. Driven by both personal rivalry and political calculation, Pompey aligned himself with Caesar's enemies in the Senate, effectively setting the stage for a showdown. Crossing the Rubicon, a point of no return. Caesar's return to Rome was fraught with legal and political obstacles. His enemies in the Senate sought to strip him of his command and prosecute him for alleged misconduct during his campaign. The legal proceedings were a ploy to dismantle his power, and Caesar knew that entering Rome as a private citizen would leave him vulnerable to these attacks. He also knew that marching into the city with his legions would be considered an act of war. In early 49 BCE, Caesar reached the Rubicon River, a shallow stream that marked the boundary between his province and Rome. As he stood on the riverbank, he faced a decision that would shape the course of history. Crossing the Rubicon with his army would be seen as a direct challenge to the Senate's authority, a declaration of civil war. For Caesar, there was no turning back. He famously declared, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast, and led his troops across the river. This act ignited a chain of events that plunged Rome into civil war. The phrase "crossing the Rubicon" became immortalized as a symbol of passing a point of no return, a reminder of the fateful moment when Caesar chose ambition and power over compromise and reconciliation. Civil war and Caesar's tactical brilliance. The war that followed was brutal and unpredictable, pitting Caesar's forces against those loyal to Pompey and the Senate. Caesar, a master tactician, demonstrated his adaptability and resilience in every battle. His army was smaller than Pompey's, yet he used his soldiers' loyalty and experience to great advantage. For Caesar's soldiers, the campaign in Gaul had forged unbreakable bonds, and their loyalty to him was absolute. The Civil War saw Caesar engage in numerous skirmishes, sieges, and set-piece battles. One of the most decisive engagements occurred at Pharsalus in 48 BCE, where Caesar faced Pompey's much larger army. Pompey's forces initially had the advantage, but Caesar's tactical ingenuity turned the tide. Despite being outnumbered, he used a clever arrangement of reserves to counter Pompey's cavalry and ultimately forced his rival to flee. This victory marked the beginning of the end for Pompey's forces, as Caesar continued to pursue his enemies across the Mediterranean. The aftermath of Pharsalus was grim for the Republic. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was assassinated upon arrival, an act that shocked Caesar, who had hoped to spare his old ally and rival. Caesar's pursuit of Pompey had taken him far from Rome, and during his time in Egypt, he became entangled in the politics of the Ptolemaic kingdom. It was here that he met Cleopatra, the young and charismatic queen who would play a significant role in both his personal life and his political ambitions. Caesar and Cleopatra, a political and personal alliance. Cleopatra was no mere romantic interest for Caesar. She was a powerful and astute leader in her own right. As a descendant of Alexander the Great's general, Ptolemy, Cleopatra ruled over Egypt, one of the wealthiest and most culturally advanced regions of the ancient world. She sought Caesar's support to solidify her position on the throne, while Caesar recognized the strategic benefits of aligning himself with Egypt's resources and influence. Their alliance was both political and personal. Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Ptolemy Caesar, whom the people affectionately called Caesarion. Though Caesar never officially recognized Caesarion as his heir, his relationship with Cleopatra alarmed the Senate. For them, this liaison was yet another indication that Caesar's ambitions extended beyond Rome. They feared that he might attempt to establish a dynasty, undermining the Republic's very foundations. Return to Rome, Caesar's reforms and his rise to dictatorship. Upon his return to Rome, Caesar was hailed as a hero by the people, but the Senate remained suspicious and uneasy. Caesar, however, was undeterred. He used his newfound power to implement a series of reforms aimed at addressing the grievances of Rome's lower classes and stabilizing the empire. These reforms included redistributing land to veterans, restructuring debt laws, and revising the calendar to create the Julian calendar, a system still in use today. But Caesar's reforms, while popular among the people, only deepened the Senate's fears. To them, his actions signaled a shift toward autocracy. In 44 BCE, Caesar took the title of Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, a move that broke with the traditional limitations on Roman power. The Senate saw this as a direct affront to the Republic's values of shared power and governance. By now, Caesar's power had become absolute, and his enemies grew increasingly desperate. The Ides of March, the assassination of Caesar. On the 15th of March 44 BCE, the Ides of March, Caesar's fate was sealed. A conspiracy had been brewing among a group of senators, including his close associate Brutus and the senator Cassius. Their motives were complex, fueled by both genuine concern for the Republic's survival and personal grievances. They believed that Caesar's assassination was the only way to save Rome from descending into tyranny. As Caesar entered the Senate chambers, he was surrounded by the conspirators and stabbed 23 times. The assassination was swift, brutal, and shocking. According to legend, his last words were "Et tu, Brute?" and "You, Brutus?" a phrase that has since come to symbolize ultimate betrayal. With Caesar's death, the senators believed they had preserved the Republic, but in reality, they had set the stage for even greater upheaval. Aftermath: the death of Caesar and the rise of the Roman Empire. The assassination of Caesar plunged Rome into chaos. The conspirators had underestimated Caesar's popularity, and instead of restoring the Republic, their actions ignited another series of civil wars. Caesar's loyal followers, particularly Mark Antony and Caesar's adopted heir Octavian, the future Augustus, rallied to avenge him. The ensuing conflict would lead to the defeat of the conspirators and the eventual establishment of the Roman Empire. For Rome, the death of Caesar marked the end of the Republic. His life and legacy had transformed Rome from a city-state to a burgeoning empire, but it had come at the cost of the Republic's democratic ideals. The events that followed Octavian's rise to power and the formalization of the imperial system were a direct consequence of Caesar's conquests, reforms, and ultimate ambition. Legacy of Caesar: a conqueror, a reformer, and a symbol of power. Julius Caesar's legacy is a complex tapestry woven from both his achievements and his ambitions. He was a military genius whose campaigns in Gaul expanded Rome's territories and cemented his status as one of history's greatest generals. He was also a reformer whose changes to Roman law and society had lasting impacts on the empire. Yet his ambition, his pursuit of absolute power, and his disregard for the Senate's authority set him on a path that would ultimately destroy the republic he claimed to serve. In the centuries since his death, Caesar has remained a symbol of power and ambition, a figure who inspires both admiration and caution. His life serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked authority, the price of ambition, and the fragility of democratic institutions. The story of Caesar is not merely a tale of conquest and political intrigue. It is a timeless reflection on human nature, the allure of power, and the complexities of leadership. The aftermath of Caesar's assassination, the rise of Octavian, and the fall of the Republic. When Julius Caesar fell on the Ides of March, his assassins believed they had saved the Roman Republic. They imagined a triumphant return to the values of shared governance, where senators ruled Rome together without the shadow of dictatorship looming over them. But their vision was painfully naive. Caesar's death was not the end of Rome's troubles. In many ways, it was only the beginning. In the wake of the assassination, Rome became a cauldron of chaos, intrigue, and bloodshed. The Republic, which had already been teetering on the edge, was plunged into a new civil war. Power shifted to Caesar's former allies and protégés, men who would soon become rivals in a brutal struggle for control. Among them was a young man named Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, whose ascent to power would ultimately spell the end of the Republic and the birth of the Roman Empire. Rome in chaos, the power vacuum, and the rise of the Second Triumvirate. Caesar's assassination left a void that no single man could fill. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and one of Rome's most skilled generals, initially seized control. Antony had the backing of Caesar's veterans and the support of the public, who mourned Caesar as a fallen hero. To the people of Rome, the conspirators were not liberators but traitors who had robbed them of a beloved leader. However, Antony was not alone in his ambitions. Caesar had named his 18-year-old grandnephew, Octavian, as his heir and adopted son. This young man, seemingly inexperienced and unassuming, held one of Rome's most powerful legacies, Caesar's name. Octavian knew that wielding this legacy was key to his rise, and he began maneuvering himself into a position of influence, even as others underestimated him. In 43 BCE, Octavian, Antony, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, a political alliance with the stated goal of restoring order to Rome and avenging Caesar's death. This alliance was formalized through a brutal campaign against Caesar's assassins, leading to the proscriptions, a series of politically motivated executions targeting anyone deemed disloyal to the triumvirate. It was a grim and bloody purge that solidified their power but alienated much of the Roman elite. Together, they pursued Brutus and Cassius, the leaders of Caesar's assassins, culminating in the decisive Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. There, Antony and Octavian's forces defeated the remaining conspirators, sealing the fate of the Republic's old guard. However, once their common enemies were eliminated, the triumvirate's unity began to crumble under the weight of ambition and mistrust. The tension between Antony and Octavian, the battle for Rome's future. The alliance between Octavian and Antony was always fragile. Antony was a seasoned military commander, older and more experienced, while Octavian was young but shrewd, with an unyielding drive for power. The two men had vastly different visions for Rome's future, and their rivalry quickly grew into open hostility. Antony's relationship with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, further complicated matters. The two had formed a powerful political and romantic alliance, and together, they dreamed of ruling over a vast Eastern empire. Cleopatra, a descendant of the Ptolemaic line, was fiercely intelligent and ambitious, and she saw in Antony an opportunity to secure her throne and expand her influence. To Octavian and the people of Rome, however, Antony's partnership with Cleopatra was a betrayal. It fueled fears that Antony intended to abandon Rome and establish a foreign monarchy with Cleopatra by his side. Octavian capitalized on these fears, portraying Antony as a traitor who had forsaken his Roman heritage for the love of an exotic queen. In a masterstroke of propaganda, Octavian read Antony's will aloud to the Senate, revealing that Antony intended to be buried in Alexandria rather than Rome, a scandalous revelation that painted Antony as a man willing to forsake the Republic for Cleopatra. The stage was set for a final showdown between the two men who sought to rule Rome. The Battle of Actium, the clash of empires. In 31 BCE, Octavian's forces met Antony and Cleopatra's navy in the waters off Actium, in a battle that would determine the fate of Rome. Octavian's general, Agrippa, was a brilliant strategist, and his fleet quickly gained the upper hand. Antony's ships, weighed down by heavy artillery, struggled to maneuver, while Agrippa's lighter, faster vessels outflanked and overwhelmed them. As the battle raged, Cleopatra's fleet suddenly retreated, and Antony, overcome with despair or possibly trusting Cleopatra's judgment, abandoned his men to follow her. This act was seen as both a tactical blunder and a betrayal of his own forces. The remaining soldiers, demoralized and leaderless, surrendered, marking the end of Antony's ambitions. With the defeat at Actium, Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria, where, cornered by Octavian's forces, they each took their own lives rather than face humiliation in Rome. Octavian's victory at Actium was not merely a military triumph. It marked the death knell of the Republic. With Antony and Cleopatra gone, Octavian stood unopposed as the ruler of Rome. Octavian's transformation into Augustus, the birth of the empire. In the years that followed, Octavian solidified his power. He knew that the Roman people, weary from decades of civil war, craved stability. Rather than declare himself king, an unthinkable title in Rome, which prided itself on its hatred of monarchy, he adopted the title princeps, meaning first citizen. This title allowed him to present himself as a humble servant of the Republic, even as he amassed unparalleled power. In 27 BCE, the Senate granted him the honorific title of Augustus, meaning the revered one. It was a carefully crafted title, suggesting both authority and divine favor without directly challenging Rome's republican ideals. This marked the beginning of the Roman Empire, with Augustus as its first emperor. Though he outwardly maintained the trappings of republican governance, Augustus wielded absolute control over Rome's military, finances, and political institutions. Augustus' rule ushered in a period known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, an era of relative stability and prosperity that would last for over 2 centuries. Under his leadership, Rome expanded its borders, secured its frontiers, and embarked on ambitious building projects that transformed the city into a showcase of imperial grandeur. Augustus' reign was not without its challenges, but his pragmatic approach to governance set the template for future emperors and cemented his legacy as the founder of the Roman Empire. The legacy of Caesar and the transformation of Rome. The rise of Augustus marked the culmination of Julius Caesar's ambition and legacy. Caesar's life and death had set into motion a series of events that ultimately led to the end of the Republic and the birth of an empire. Augustus, Caesar's adopted heir, would rule for over 4 decades, bringing stability and a new order to a Rome that had been fractured by civil wars. Under Augustus, the ideals of the Republic were preserved only in name. The Senate continued to exist, but its power was now subordinate to the emperor's will. The Republic that Caesar had once championed had evolved into a centralized imperial system, ruled by a single figure whose authority was unchallenged. Caesar's influence endured not only through Augustus but also through the empire he helped create. The Roman Empire would continue to expand, reaching its zenith under later emperors. The transformation of Rome from a republic to an empire remains one of history's most profound shifts, a testament to the ambitions of Julius Caesar and the enduring legacy of his life. In the centuries since, historians have debated whether Caesar's actions saved Rome or doomed it. Did he pave the way for the stability that Augustus would bring, or did he destroy the Republic's democratic ideals? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. Caesar's life serves as a reminder of both the potential and the dangers of unchecked ambition, of how the dreams of one man can alter the course of history for generations to come.